Well, hello and welcome back to one of my informal trainings. Today we're going to be looking at some of the specific guidelines and the recommendations for face coverings. Now, I recognize that this may be a very sensitive subject for a lot of us. It's something that we have somewhat grown used to over the past almost 10, 11 months at the time of this particular recording. But there was something that came up in my life that really spurred this ahead. So I want to start by showing you a particular email communication that I was part of. And so this particular email came across from JJCloward, and as you can see right here, he works for the Salt Lake County Health Department. And I was asking him about some of the FAQs and other things. And one of the most interesting things that he let me know was right here towards the bottom of his communication, where he said the risk of transmission is still sufficient to ask them to quarantine the prescribed 14 days from close contact, even if masks were worn. And it was really those words that got me thinking, even if masks were worn, how, how effective are face coverings? I do love to report quite a bit on the political nature and dealings in the state of Utah. And recently, there have been quite a number of state directives. So as we can see right here on the coronavirusutah.gov website, we have all of these health orders. And my goodness, look how many we have, ladies and gentlemen, going all the way back to the very first in March of this year. As you can see right here, and I apologize, it's loaded sideways, but on March 6th of 2020, which, believe it or not, is only about a month and a half away, the state of emergency due to the coronavirus will be 1 year old here in the state of Utah. So as we were looking this over, I wanted to just look at and understand all of these articles and the evidence that is available for face coverings. Now, before we get into this, one of the things that I, again, want to really preface this with is these are my opinions, these are my findings. My hope is that today's broadcast will encourage all of us to get out and start reading a little bit more. And so before we get into it, I want to start by sharing with you this particular article that I really liked, which is how to read and understand a scientific article. We're going to be looking at a number of them today. And again, I'll post all of this down below and encourage you to read this in its entirety. But one thing that becomes very interesting are some of the lessons that we can all learn when we're reading the articles. The very first is to read the introduction, not the abstract. And we'll look at that in just a moment. The next is to identify what is the question. The third is then to look at the background and how it is, like it says here, what it is that the authors need to do next, and of course, why this research has been done. The next is to identify the specific questions in the article, and then we want to identify the approach and exactly what are the authors going to do to answer the specific questions. Now, this is a very important one, section 6, which is to read the methods section. I don't want to pause right here and just give you a little story, right? Let's say that I was to tell you or a person that I could help you lose 50% of your body weight in one day. Well, for some of us that have gone through the COVID-19 pandemic and have put on a little bit of weight, we may all be thinking, wow, that's awesome, Nate. How is it that you can do that? And I say, well, it's $10,000 and I guarantee you will lose half of your body weight. You would probably want to know, what is my method for doing that? And let's say that my method is, I'm going to cut your legs off. Well, of course, if I cut your legs off, you would lose approximately half of your body weight in one day. However, one may rightfully question, the methods to that particular type of weight loss and if it is an effective means for what we're really looking at. So this is where we want to fully understand the work. The next is to read the results section, and we'll be looking at that. Now, there are a lot of different words that are significant, right? So we want to try to understand just exactly what the results actually mean. And the best thing, or the best way you can do that, is to just write down what they actually are. Uh, Different words like significant and non-significant, they have statistical meanings for these researchers. And again, most of us, myself included, I am not a PhD scientist. So I'm very grateful that others have conducted this research, and then I can come through and read it and take notes and reread it many, many times. The others, we want to look at graphs and do they have error bars? We want to look at the sample size. Now again, sometimes 10 people is sufficient, but 10,000 is obviously a little bit better. And like it says right here, for most studies, larger is better. Then we want to look at and determine the results, and do those results answer the specific questions? And you'll see this in just a moment. We also then want to read the conclusions and the discussion, and then look at this, ladies and gentlemen. The very last thing to do is to go back to the beginning and read the abstract. And again, my hope is that as we go through this, we'll be able to understand more and more about why this is so important. Now, the other thing is we want to start by looking at just exactly what are some of the different considerations that exist. So let me pop up another link right here. So again, this was updated as of December 18th. I would encourage everybody to keep coming in and watch these dates, right? The CDC is updating this data quite regularly. And so here it has considerations for wearing masks. We have the evidence for how masks are effective, whether you should wear a mask or not wear a mask, and the list goes on and on as it relates to the type of masks, and a lot of different graphics that maybe some of us have seen and maybe some of us have not seen. But again, there's a lot of data that continues to come out. And today, we're going to be looking specifically at just a number of studies about COVID-19. So as we come to the Centers for Disease Control COVID-19 website, go ahead and click on the More button, and then we want to go to the Science and Research. Under the Science and Research, there are a lot of different articles here, but we want to dig into it a little bit deeper. So we're going to go to the Science Briefs, and then under that, we're going to come down to the scientific brief on cloth masks. So again, this was updated a few months ago, and down below, we're going to see all of these references, all right? So these references are used in this particular article as relates to community use of cloth control or cloth masks to control the spread of SARS-CoV-2 or the coronavirus. So as we look through it, we can see as of today, we have 45 articles. Now, I don't want to take up too much time. Initially, I was thinking that we would be able to cover all 45 articles, but based on time, I don't think that we're going to be able to get there today. But we'll do our very best. And if you like this, if there's enough views, I would love to come back and discuss all of these research articles because they are quite fascinating in what they indicate or don't indicate. So let's come down and we're going to start with, how about this? We just start with reference number 1. So if we click on this, it's going to take you to what's called PubMed. Now, PubMed is where published medical journals sit and are housed. You can see if we click in here, the only thing that we get is the abstract. Now, remember what we just learned, ladies and gentlemen, that you do not want to read the abstract at first. And the specific reasons, I apologize, I'm jumping around, is that the abstract is a dense first paragraph at the beginning of a paper. In fact, that's often the only part of the paper that many non-scientists read. Okay? Now, like it says, this is a terrible practice. Don't do it. And the reason for that is, what will happen is that we may be inadvertently biased, like it says right here, in the author's interpretation. And that's exactly what this abstract is that the authors have given us an overview. Now again, it's nice that that's what the CDC has given us, but we want to go to the entire article. So right here you can just click and that should open up the entire article. Again, implications of silent transmission for the control of COVID-19 outbreaks. Now again, we have the abstract right at the top. We then have results. We have wonderful graphs, a discussion. materials and methods, and then we have some acknowledgments and a list of other references for this particular study. Now, there's a couple ways that I'm going to be searching these articles based on some of my notes. If you just hit a find feature, it will click up a opportunity for you to just populate some words in here. So one of the things that we're going to look at first is they reference some empirical studies. If we type in the word studies, we see right here under the abstract this notion that empirical studies have indicated individuals may be most infectious during the pre-symptomatic phase, an unusual characteristic for a respiratory infection. Again, we have to look at specific words in here, which in this case it's may be. Now in science, when we prove something or when a scientist proves a cause and effect, they do not use the words may be. So this idea of pre-symptomatic, or what we all refer to as asymptomatic, like it says here, is an unusual characteristic for respiratory infection. So the next word that we want to search up here is going to be the face coverings. And if we type in face, you notice we don't get any references to masks or face coverings. We can even try typing the word mask in, and same thing, we get no references. The other issue with this particular study is that this transmission does not really address anything as it relates to the control measures that were available or not available. So there are really no clear conclusions in this particular article. But once again, if we come back to the CDC website, it is listed as a strong reference, the first reference on the use of cloth masks. So again, I would just caution us because this very first reference references nothing about cloth masks. Well, let's move on to article number 2. And this is a little bit of a tricky one because we see that we have individuals referenced and we see a statement: controlling COVID-19 requires preventing SARS-CoV-2 transmission from people without symptoms. And it was submitted in 2020. But there is no link. As I have tried my very best to find this particular article, I cannot find this article. I've gone on Twitter looking at the CDC account, and there are many people asking for this particular M.A. Johansson article, and it does not exist from what I can tell. But once again, it is cited as a reference, but unfortunately, we do not have a reference. Instead, all we have is a single line. So take that as with a grain of salt as well. Let's move down to article number 3. And again, we click on the link here and we'll leave the website. We'll say that's fine. I notice that now we're at, again, a particular spot where we have, once again, only the abstract. So make sure you're always clicking on the full text, and off to the races we go. Now, under this particular study, we want to look at exactly how it is that they were conducting this study. Well, one of the ways that they did this was they were looking at coughing. So this is a very, very big study on reducing expulsion simulated from cough-generated aerosols. Okay, so what they did here is they actually, instead of just studying the cough in humans, what they did is they did this with a simulator. And so in here it says, the materials and methods in our experiments, a cough aerosol simulator propelled the test aerosol through a head form into the chamber. Now again, that's very interesting. We'll see as we keep going through this. But again, very interesting as it relates to this particular study not using a human as relates to a cough and generating that with a simulation. Again, nothing in this study was conducted on normal breathing through the nose and or mouth or speaking. And of course, there are many references. If we type in the word may, we have 13 references to the word may. If we type in can, we have 39 references to the word can. If we type in the word believe, we don't have any of those or even believed. From here, we scroll down and we actually want to look at a couple of things here. And the first one that we want to look at is what they were studying with the with the size. So let me get to that spot. All right, so we're actually going to look at some of the limitations that existed within this particular study. So as it says right here, we see our study has several limitations. But as we come down underneath the results, and then we get down under the discussion component of this, we see that the researchers give us a heads up on their particular article. So let's read this. Our study has several limitations. We used a single cough volume airflow profile, an aerosol size distribution for our studies. These parameters can vary greatly from person to person. We examined the performance of these devices during simulated coughing, but not breathing or speaking, which have different airflow rates and aerosol size distributions. Some internal losses of the test aerosol particles likely occurred during the settling or impaction on the surfaces of the collection chamber, which may affect the estimates of the collection efficiencies. We only used a single representative example of each type of device. The shape and composition of face coverings vary widely, and this would be expected to affect the performance of individual devices. Some face masks have exhalation valves or vents, which could reduce their efficacy as source control devices. The fit of a particular mask to an individual wearer and compliance in wearing the mask correctly, i.e. over the nose and mouth, also are important factors in how well the mask performs as a source control device. The face shield that we tested has a widely used design, but alternative designs are being marketed that provide greater facial coverage and in some cases include fabric skirts between the shield and the face. These alternative face shield designs might perform better in source controlled devices. Now, very interested as we get through this, because we can also see that as they went through, there are a number of things here to consider, right? Where, number one, their study or their findings were very specific to this particular device. And again, what they are saying as it relates to their particular efficacy of the face shield is questionable based on the inability for this particular study to demonstrate the effects in a human being and with a variety of face coverings. All right. So a number of things that are in here that are quite interesting to consider. And again, my hope is that each of you can take the time to look through it on your own. So let's jump back as we try to keep this moving forward. So the next article we want to look at is article number 4. And this one is titled Low Cost Measurement of a Face Mask Efficacy for Filtering Expelled Droplets During Speech. So again, we just click on the link and no surprise, we're still given just the abstract. So again, if we click on this link, we're actually able to go to the entire article. Now, this particular article is a little bit interesting as we look at the particular opening and leading statement, which is void of proof or research and really leads the rest of the article, right? And so if we look at this, it says mandates for mask use in public during the recent coronavirus disease, 2019 COVID-19 pandemic, worsened by global shortage of commercial supplies, have led to widespread use of homemade masks and mask alternative. It is assumed that wearing such masks reduces the likelihood for an infected person to spread the disease, but many of these mask designs have not been tested in practice. And again, this is just in September of this year. What they then did is they went through and looked at 14 different types of masks in a proof of principle study. Now, if you look up a proof of principle study, this is a very low scientific assurance with those type of studies. And it also assumes that 100% of COVID-19 is transmitted on water droplets. And further, it shows that these droplets are often broken up and escape in higher volume through the face covering. So again, somewhat interesting as they identified all of this. And here's a look at the 14 different type of face coverings that were under investigation. Now, we were told that gaiters, number 11, bandanas, number 12, and a variety of things were very effective. But again, in here we found that a variety of different masks performed very, very, very differently. So again, if you are looking for a particular type of mask, we did see in this particular study that the performance of the valved N95 mask is likely affected by the exhalation valve. So this is where one of the ideas of having a valved face mask was then removed, where initially it was said, oh, you might be able to do that as well. All right, so a lot of interesting things in this article, but again, some of the things that in this article that I found very interesting is as it performed a proof of principle study, and then it also talks about the water droplets being broken up. All right, so as we come down to the discussion of this particular article, we find at the very bottom something interesting, right? And it talks here about particular droplet sizes. And for the droplet sizes here, they're looking at what is actually 10 to the negative 6, which is about 300 times larger than the coronavirus, which is approximately 120 nanometers. So where it can stop very large droplet sizes, we see that it is not stopping something as small as the coronavirus. As we keep reading through here, we see that our proof of principle experiments only involved a small number of speakers, but our setup can serve as a base for future studies with a larger cohort of speakers and checks a mask performance under a variety of conditions. So again, great study, but is it conclusive? Should we utilize this particular study as a way for saying that these low-cost face coverings are effective, and that if I'm wearing a face covering, I should feel and be 100% safe? Again, I'll invite you to read the article yourself and let me know what you think of it. As we try to move on here, we'll get to our next article, which is article number 5. And this is visualizing the effectiveness of face masks in obstructing respiratory jets. So same thing, we'll click on the link, and here we are. No surprise, we only get the abstract. And so we'll click on the link to get the entire article. Now under here, we find that this one opens up again with a very interesting opening line where it says, the masks help mitigate the risks of cross-infection via respiratory droplets. Okay, so we can see right now a little bit of bias, right? Because out of the first 4 articles that we've read so far, my thoughts are we have yet to demonstrate that they are actually doing that at a with the level of certainty that this particular sentence would lead us to believe. The second thing is we want to look at some of the symptoms and some of the findings in this article. And what it says right here, current estimates indicate that about 35% of infective individuals do not display overt symptoms and may contribute to the significant spread of the disease without their knowledge. So again, we want to make sure that we continue to focus in on these words of may and may not, right? So a lot of those that have recovered from COVID-19 have never developed a symptom at all. Now, where I find this interesting from a statistics perspective is that if 35% of people never got symptoms, then did they ever go get tested? And the answer is we simply do not know, right? But the more people that have the disease and recover from the disease, that will in turn drive down the infection rate. And I want to look at something very briefly now that we're on that topic. All right, so just a couple days ago, I received this particular email from Stuart Adams, and he's the president of the Utah State Senate. And he goes through and he talks about a variety of different things in this particular publication, which again is quite nice. Now, if we get down here, we see a very interesting statement. Utah's case fatality rates are the lowest in the nation at 0.0045. That means if you test positive for COVID-19 in Utah, you have a 99.55% chance of survival. Again, the lowest case fatality rate in the nation. And again, why is that important? Well, as we come back to this particular article, it may even be higher than that based on how many people do have the disease. The other thing that we want to look at here is some of the particular testing that this experiment utilized. And one of the things that they used is they used a particular type of cough. And if we come here, it was what they referred to as a sputum-producing coughing. One of the things that we also want to consider with all of these articles is also some of the references that are used in the article itself, and these particular articles do carry some bias and some interesting results themselves. So one of those is this article that's referenced, which is a study of tuberculosis. And in this particular study of tuberculosis, which we won't take the time to go through because it's a very, very long section, but here they exclusively studied what is called a deep sputum-producing coughing. So that is a violent cough, a cough where you are coughing hard enough to attempt to drive sputum or mucus out of your lungs and up into your mouth that can then be either spit out or expelled. So very interesting to know that in the article that we're looking at currently, that is one of the strong points in the studies. So again, a lot of this has some very strong visuals. And as I was reading the article, I thought, man, this is really interesting. Here we have the person with the mask on, and then they start breathing. We can see all of the leakage that is occurring at the top and the bottom and the sides, but we can also see a large leak that comes through the mouth and through the mask. Well, as I was looking at that, I started to wonder, what is it that is, interesting about that? And they said right here at the very bottom, in addition to providing an initial indication of the effectiveness of protective equipment, the visuals used in this study can help convey to the general public the rationale behind social distancing guidelines and recommendations for using face masks. So again, throughout this particular study, they were finding that if a person was wearing a face mask, as it shows here, uncovered, a jet was able to cover 8 feet, a bandana about 3 feet, a handkerchief, 1.5 feet, a stitched mask, 2.5 feet, and a commercial mask, kind of unknown material, 8 inches. But again, we have to know and understand that these distances that they're studying are specific to how they were utilizing a mannequin and the method for that particular jet or expulsion, which was, again, a cough. And so we want to make sure, like I referenced earlier about losing weight and cutting your legs off, are these particular studies working or not? And we see so much leakage that goes on within these masks that unless you're wearing the mask correctly, the opinion of this article, and my opinion is, that mask is not doing much, if anything, for you. All right? But let's go back. We'll keep this moving forward. And again, hopefully, if anything, this is just getting some creative thoughts going about this idea of face coverings. We're on number 6. So hang in there, ladies and gentlemen. Same thing. We come in and we don't get much about this article. This is one you may have to buy it. I'll include a link to the article. All right, so getting right back into it, we have article number 6. And article number 6 talks about face coverings and masks to minimize droplet dispersion and aerosolization, a video case study. Now this is an interesting one because if we click on it, things have recently changed. There used to be an abstract available here, but here you can see there is no abstract available. The link to go to the PubMed is not functioning, but we can try to copy that. And as you can see, we still don't get that particular article. So if we click on the link that'll move us over to the BMJ Journals for Thorax, we see once again that we have to request permission or we have to buy the article for $37. So article 6 is a little bit tough one. Now, this one, as I went in and did read it, and I purchased just a brief access to it, so I don't have it here today. I apologize for that. But what they were looking at is they were trying to determine the difference between a one layer versus two layer, and in the end, the thought was that more layers were better, and I think we can understand that. All right, so again, difficult because if we want to actually look at these references that the CDC is providing, it would be great if we could actually have access to those particular studies that they are referencing. So let's move on to number 7. So number 7 is testing the efficacy of homemade masks. Would they protect in an influenza pandemic? Now this one becomes rather interesting. I'm going to show you why. This is one of the few articles that was actually published years ago. So this is a 2013 study. Again, very brief here, so we want to click on the link to go to the entire article. And this particular article has some very interesting things that to look at. So a few things as we run through it that we want to look at is they looked at several household materials to see if that could block bacterial and viral aerosols. This one, they actually had 21 healthy volunteers who made their own masks, and then they were tested for a fit and the number of microorganisms isolated from the coughs on their homemade masks or surgical masks. So rather nice because we actually have real people doing this particular test, which is great to see that. Okay, so down here under methods and materials, we see surgical masks have been considered the type of mask most likely to be used by the general public, and these were used as a control. The pressure drop across each of the materials was measured to determine the comfort and fit between face and mask that would be needed to make the material usable in mask form. We devised a protocol for constructing a homemade mask based on the design of a surgical mask, and volunteers were invited to make their own. Okay, so they had these people make their own masks. As we can see, some of them used a cotton shirt, a scarf, a tea towel, pillowcase, antimicrobial pillowcase, the surgical mask, vacuum cleaner bag, cotton mix, linen, and silk. All right. So here we're looking at the percent filtration efficiency, the bacteria, and the pressure drop. All right. And so we saw down here that there were two microorganisms that were used to simulate particle challenge as they went through. It was 12 men and 9 women that were making their own masks. So then they had to determine the fit of the masks, and volunteers were instructed to fit their surgical and homemade masks with no help or guidance from the operator, and to ensure that the mask was comfortable for 2 minutes, and were given time to purge any particles trapped inside the mask. So the fit test was then conducted with volunteers performing the following consecutive exercise, each lasting 96 seconds. I don't know why 96, but that's a little over a minute and a half. Normal breathing, deep breathing, head moving side to side and up and down. All right. So then what they did is they looked at this particular sample chamber, and what happened. Now, what happened in here was the biggest test that they were using here was coughing only. All right, and that is really the biggest thing. Like it says right here, the number of microorganisms from coughs. So we still don't know from this particular study the effectiveness of the mask with normal breathing or breathing out of your nose, which again is just something interesting to look at. From there, they conducted this particular questionnaire about their opinions from wearing the mask. And like it says right here, in the questionnaire on mask use during a pandemic, 6 participants said they would wear a mask some of the time, 6 said they would never wear a mask, and 9 either did not know or were undecided. None of the participants said they would wear a mask all the time. With one exception, all participants reported that their face mask was comfortable. However, The length of time each participant kept their mask on during the testing was minimal, only 15 minutes. And that's very different than today. We're instructed to wear a face mask pretty much all the time, right? We are given an opportunity to take it off, but it is very, very limited how we do that, right? So there's another really important conclusion in this article, and that's under the discussion where it says right here, although any material may provide, again, there's that word again, may, a physical barrier to an infection, if as a mask it does not fit well around the nose and mouth, or the material freely allows infectious aerosols to pass through it, and here's an important line, then it will be of no benefit. Not reduced benefit, of no benefit. So very interesting to consider that, right? In this article, it also goes on to state, it is likely that materials conditioned with water vapor to create a fabric similar, let's find that really quick because this is an important area, to create a fabric similar to that which has been worn for a couple of hours would show very different filtration efficacies and pressure drops. So what it's trying to say here is that the longer you wear the mask, the less effective the mask is. And again, they were only using the mask for 15 minutes in this particular study. So another important part here is the conclusion. And right here in the conclusion, it says, an improvised face mask should be viewed as the last possible alternative if a supply of commercial face masks is not available, irrespective of the disease, which it may, and again, here it is, may be required for protection. Improvised homemade face masks may be used to help protect those who could potentially, for example, be at occupational risk from close or frequent contact, and here's the important part of this study, with symptomatic patients. Nothing about asymptomatic, right? And again, like it says here, as a result, we would not recommend the use of homemade face masks as a method of reducing transmission of infection from aerosols. Now, when I saw that, it made me think back to the particular nature of this study, right? And if we look at it, again, this study is a particular reference under the use of cloth masks. And we have just seen, ladies and gentlemen, that not many of these are supporting, and in fact, number 7 is stating right here to not recommend homemade face masks. So again, you be the judge of this. Article number 8, respiratory virus shedding in exhaled breath and efficacy of face masks. So again, we click on this guy. Now, one of the important things is how this particular article opens up with this line. Our results indicate that surgical face masks, and here's that word again, could prevent transmission of human coronaviruses and influenza viruses from, and here's another important part, symptomatic individuals. So again, ladies and gentlemen, this is a scientific journal published just in April of this year as all of this was starting to get going, and we're seeing what this does or does not state. Now again, the focus of this study was in fact on surgical face masks and surgical face coverings, all right? So we can come through and look at this briefly. All right, so if we jump down to the results, this particular study looked at 246 individuals. So it's a nice study, right? And then it says among these 246 participants, 122, or 50%, were randomized to not wearing a face mask during the first exhaled breath of collection, and 124 were randomized to wear a face mask. Overall, 49 voluntarily provided a second exhaled breath collection of the alternate type. All right? Now, again, that's very strange here that, number one, out of the 246, that's how they did it. But then if we look at it down below, the infections of at least one respiratory virus were confirmed. Okay, now out of this, we had 123 participants were infected with the a human seasonal coronavirus. All right. So as we again consider this, it's rather interesting to see that this far surpasses any of the current tests versus positive that we have seen in Utah. All right. The other findings are specific to these respiratory droplets, and they admit that COVID is an aerosol and that it travels as an aerosol as well as in the droplets, though they fail to state the statistical variance between those two. Now, the other important here is we want to look at reference, right? And it says, our findings indicate that surgical masks can effectively reduce the emission of influenza virus particles into the environment in respiratory droplets, but not in aerosols. Okay? Then the most interesting thing about it is if we get right to the bottom, it says this has important implications for control of COVID-19, suggesting that surgical masks could be used by ill people to reduce onward transmission. So again, very consistent that this is saying ill people and that it could be used, or that its suggestion could be used to reduce the transmission. All right. But again, let's look at, were there any limitations of this particular study? All right, and as we come through, it's nice that they actually admit that the major limitation of our study was the large proportion of participants with undetectable viral shedding in exhaled breath for each of the viruses studied. We could have increased the sampling duration beyond 30 minutes to increase the viral shedding being captured at the cost of acceptability in some participants. So basically what they're saying here is the participants did not like breathing into their device for more than 30 minutes. However, they're also saying that it was an undetectable viral shedding for a lot of those participants. Okay? And again, you be the judge of this particular article if, based on the methods and how it was conducted, if we feel like this is really a great reference as it is purported to be, right? Under this heading of the scientific brief. All right, so let's keep moving on. Again, taking a lot of time here and probably at the same time not taking enough time. So the next articles, face coverings and respiratory tract droplet dispersion. So again, let's hit this guy and see just exactly what we have here. Now we have just the abstract. That's not going to help us much at all. So we actually want to get to the full article. And this particular, well, one of the interesting things about it is it says this article is a preprint and has not been peer reviewed. It reports new medical research and has yet to be evaluated, and so should not be used as a guide to guide clinical practice. So again, I think that in of itself is pretty strong, right? But let's go ahead and jump into the actual article here. All right, so as we click to download the PDF, now we've got the entire article up. So one of the things that is very strange is where it says respiratory droplets are the primary transmission route for SARS-CoV-2. Now the interesting thing is no study has proven that as of yet. In fact, most studies are indicating that respiratory droplets are a source, but aerosol is still one of the biggest ways that any flu, including the 120 nanometer coronavirus transmission rate. So starting with that in of itself is very, very strange. Now it does become a little bit more honest as we get down into the discussion section. So let's jump there briefly. All right, and right down here, we see that in the discussion, we see as these droplets are likely to be the main driver. So that in of itself is quite a bit more honest. And then it goes on to say our data suggest that the wearing of face masks can substantially reduce the probability of an infected person transmitting the virus. Now, different than some of the other articles, this one actually showed that a single layer of cotton can control most, if not all, of the respiratory droplets. So let's look at that briefly. Like I was saying, this particular article is talking about a single layer mask. And it says right here, our results indicate that face coverings show consistent efficacy at blocking respiratory droplets. Now, again, this is kind of interesting because the CDC says if you wear a single layer, you're not following the rules, that it needs to be 2 or even 3 or even more. So again, it's strange that we're seeing some of these inconsistencies inside of these articles. Now, another part under the discussion that's interesting with this study is where it says other studies, such as, for example, Fisher et al., which focuses on in-flight droplets and that include smaller droplets and aerosol, are likely to show a lower level of effectiveness depending on the fabric type. Okay, so again, very interesting where if we assume that the coronavirus is being transmitted on very large water droplets, then perhaps this article is correct. However, this article is also saying that these large droplets may not be the only driver, and in fact are not the only driver, and dependent upon aerosols and other factors, that face covering may be very, very ineffective. The next part of this article that is very interesting is where it talks about the data, and it says the data do not allow us to draw conclusions on the risks of virus transmission through aerosol inhalation. Assuming that SARS-CoV-2 virus transmission through aerosol is small compared to large droplets, these results suggest that physical distancing can reduce with the use of face coverings. Where at the start of this article they said no, it's only large droplets, and you can see that the researchers have become a little more honest throughout this particular study, referencing that no, we're making a lot of assumptions here. But again, very strange article that references single layers. The other interesting things in here is the methods and the way in which so many of these assumptions or the bias of the researchers were really carried throughout this article. All right, moving on. So back here to article number 10, and this one is exhaled respiratory particles during singing and talking. Now, very interesting reference. We see that it's here. I have tried to find it. We see that it was published in Aerosol Science Technology in 2010. I cannot find it though. So I see all I can find, ladies and gentlemen, is this one line, and maybe there are some of you that are better at doing web searches than I can, but I've not been able to find it, so we'll just have to say that there is no article for us to read other than a single line that unfortunately I think this was used as a lot of churches were asked to shut down or to not sing, or if you are singing, to make sure that you keep your face mask on. But again, where is the research so that we could actually read that and study that? Moving on to Article 11. It talks about aerosol emission and super emission during human speech increase with voice loudness. So this is looking at the louder you talk, the more you are pushing out aerosol emissions. So again, we can come in, all we have is the abstract. We know that we don't read those. Let's look at the entire scientific article. Okay, now some of the things that are interested in here is they do look at a variety of different breathing techniques. All right, so if we skip down to the results section right here, we're going to see something somewhat interesting. And it says during nose breathing, in which exhaled air is directed away from the APS, the particle count is negligible. So interesting, because we're being told over and over that you need to wear face covering that covers what? Well, both your mouth and your nose. But this particular study indicated that nose breathing had negligible, meaning almost no particle count. So again, very interesting to see some of the discrepancies between cover your nose or don't cover your nose. And then we also see in the same line, shortly after vocalization commences, the number of particles rapidly increases to peak, then decreases back to 0 as a participant resumes nose breathing. So again, why are we being instructed to cover our nose if not only does it go down to something negligible, but then just a line later, it says that it goes back to zero, ladies and gentlemen. So we now have something that is studied in here, which is speech versus breathing. And that here in our discussion is where we see that, where it says, our direct comparison of particles emitted during various types of breathing versus speech demonstration demonstrates that even quiet speech yields significantly more particles than normal breathing. Again, very interesting because we're being told that just normal breathing is expelling a lot of particles out into the air, and this particular study is not showing that that is true. We see that breathing through your nose, and it is zero. Breathing through your mouth and nose, and it is almost zero. But as soon as you start to talk, you start to have significantly more particles. Now, here we are, and this is a little bit of a longer paragraph, but let's just jump into it a little bit here. And this is talking about where in the world does this, the coronavirus reside? And like it says right here, some studies suggest that human influenza viruses attach more abundantly to the large airways of the upper respiratory tract than to the bronchiolar or alveolar cells in the lower respiratory tract, while MERS-CoV and avian influenza viruses mainly cause lower respiratory tract infections. So this makes sense, right? So the upper respiratory is when we get the flu, and it resides primarily in our nose and mouth. But what they're saying with coronavirus is it's actually much deeper in our lungs, and we know that because a lot of people are severely infected with coronavirus. What happens? Well, they usually suffer breathing issues or the uptake of oxygen. And so that's where it's saying here that the greater presence of these virus receptors deep within the lungs, which again is quite interesting, and one of the reasons why normal breathing probably isn't pushing a lot out, but as you start to talk and really push on your lungs, you might be getting more particles to be expelled. Now, my only other question for this is, as we keep coming through the article, we see this particular line. More research is needed, however, the presence of asymptomatic or polycystic symptomatic superspreaders would have important public health implications in the surveillance for and mitigation of infectious disease epidemics that are spread by airborne respiratory particles. The data presented here strongly suggest that further efforts to test these hypotheses are warranted. Now, my only question that is, why is this article listed as one of the 45 articles that strongly supports face masks with that particular statement, right? So again, do we like this article? Do we not like this article? Does it prove that face masks work or not work? Again, my point to this and what I'm seeking to do here is to just create a discussion around the articles that are available. So let's jump back to number 12. So number 12 is size distribution and sites of origin of droplets expelled from the human respiratory tract during expiratory activities. So same thing, we'll click on this particular article. We have the abstract, and then off we go. So we actually have the whole article here. Now, one of the important part about this is some of the early investigations that were cited in this article is in the 20s and 40s. And what they concluded, down here it states, concluded that in general, 95% of particles were smaller than 100 nanometers. And the majority were in the range of 4 to 8. Now, why is that particularly important? Well, it's important because it can see that nearly all the small droplets originate from the front of the mouth, and only a very, very few, if any, by the way, from the nose or the throat, like it says right here. So why is that important? Well, once again, where is it that these water droplets are coming from? And the aerosolization of the coronavirus, which again, we've seen is much more of a lower respiratory tract infection. Now, if we look down below in the abstract, we see that the speech produced additional particles in modes near 3.5 to 5 nanometers. These two modes became most pronounced during sustained vocalization, producing an average concentration of 0.04 to 0.16 centimeters to the third, respectively, suggesting that the aerosolization of secretions lubricating the vocal cords is a major source of droplets in terms of number. But again, we really want to look at that and understand that these particular particles are thousands of times larger than the coronavirus. And is the coronavirus traveling exclusively on these water droplets, which now what we're seeing is these water droplets originate primarily in the front of the mouth is where these are being expelled from. So we know then, or we can postulate then, that the coronavirus is being expelled in aerosol form. And so again, if it's coming out as an aerosol, and this is studying the size and origin of these droplets back in 2009, we can very clearly see that these droplets are very, very large, but what is on them and what is detectable is another question entirely. All right? So again, are we finding articles that are proving things? Are we finding articles that are demonstrating, like the CDC is stating, that the use of cloth masks to control the spread of SARS-CoV-2? We're 12 articles into this, and I'm not very sure if we have found one yet that is consistent with that claim. Article 13 talks about how speech can produce jet-like transport relevant to asymptomatic spreading of virus. So let's come in and take a look at this particular article. So again, same thing, we're only going to get the abstract. All right, so as we click now, we are into the full article. And in this article, the interesting thing is that the study never looked at masks, but it makes the concluding statement that most significantly, well, let's actually go to that. Right here it says, most significantly, our results illustrate that 2 meters or 6 feet do not represent a wall, but rather that behavior can help minimize risk by increasing separation distances and relative position for longer conversations when masks are not used. And so, although they would present this research as conclusive, they make one other interesting admittance here. And here under their concluding remarks, they make another interesting statement where they say, obviously much remains to be done for understanding the fluid mechanics associated with simple human activities, i.e. breathing and speaking. Up above, it goes on to talk about the results presented in this paper do not account for some real features, e.g. movement of the head or trunk of the speaker and the influence of background motions of the air due to the ventilation. There's obviously much to be done to quantify the many details and nuances, especially as the different sounds in speech produce vortical structures of different strengths that influence the spread axial and transverse of the exhaled jet. So again, very interesting where we go through and we look at this, that this particular study never looked at masks, right? And they say right here, we are not trained in public health, nor do we have a standing in public health region, so we should be cautious in conclusions drawn from results regarding social distance guidelines. So again, my biggest question with all of this is, as relates to this article, why is it included in this particular study of masks when it doesn't study masks at all? Moving on to Article 14 is the effectiveness of face masks in preventing airborne transmission of SARS-CoV-2. Again, kind of a fun way for them to start this particular article is where it says guidelines from the CDC and WHO recommend the wearing of face masks to prevent the spread of coronavirus, right? But then it also goes on to say, however, the protective efficacy or efficiency of such masks against airborne transmission of infectious severe acute respiratory syndrome, droplet aerosol, is unknown. Is unknown. And again, this one has been published in October, just a few months ago. And this is coming months and months after face masks. And they're saying, well, we just don't know if these work or if they do not. Now, another interesting part about this is under the importance, where it says airborne simulation experiments showed that cotton masks, surgical masks, and N95 masks provide some protection from the transmission of infective SARS-CoV-2 droplet aerosols. However, medical masks, surgical masks, and even N95 masks could not completely block the transmission of the virus droplet aerosols, even when sealed. Even when sealed, it's stating, ladies and gentlemen, that the masks, even the N95 masks, are not completely stopping the transmission. Now, I know that a lot of people will state, and we'll look at the article here in a moment, that say that the face masks are over 80% effective. Well, we'll look at that in a moment. But this one is saying that it is not completely stopping it. Now, down below, we look at this and it says, to allow quantification, we conducted our studies by using a relatively high dose of virus. And under those conditions, it is possible that the protective capacity of the masks was exceeded. Okay, so why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because if they were using high doses of the virus and the protective capacity was exceeded, then can we really say that they were effectively showing that that they can block the virus, right? Or even it says right here, if we continue on, these results indicate that it's difficult to completely block this virus, even with a properly fitted N95 mask, right? And it says, however, it remains unknown whether the small amount of virus that was able to pass through the N95 mask would result in illness. So again, I don't know about you, but the last I checked from simple biology, it takes one sperm to contact the egg to create a pregnancy or to create new life. But here we're saying we don't know if the small amount of the virus will or will not get a person sick. So that's where the scientists have come up with this idea of viral load, right? And down below it says, in conclusion, further detailed analysis will be required to reveal the precise relationship between the protective efficiency of masks and the components of viral droplets aerosols. Our data will help medical workers understand the proper use and performance of masks, e.g. the importance of fitting masks and avoiding their reuse, and to determine whether they need additional protective equipment, e.g. a negative pressure room or positive pressure masks to protect themselves from infected patients. So this data is for medical workers, ladies and gentlemen, and again, is studying N95 masks and showing that they are not stopping the virus completely. Again, very interesting article, and my hope is that each of you that are listening to this or still with me after this long will continue your research and read more about it. Let's move on to 15. Textile masks and surface covers, a spray simulation method, and a universal droplet reduction model against respiratory pandemics. Doesn't that sound like a lot of fun? Well, here we are. We only have the abstract. We don't read those, so we'll go right into the article once again. So in this particular article, the intro is once again very full of bias, right? Where it talks about, the main form of COVID-19 transmission is via oral respiratory droplet contamination. And again, have we proved that yet? I don't think we have, right? Produced when individuals talk, well, we know that's somewhat low, sneeze, or cough, which are going to be higher. The interesting thing is this particular test only studied a sneeze, okay? And that's what it did right here, where it says, using a bacterial suspension spray simulation model of droplet ejection, mimicking a sneeze. Okay. We quantified the extent by which widely available clothing fabrics reduce the dispersion of droplets onto surfaces within 1.8 meters, the minimum distance recommended for COVID-19 social distances. Now, there are a lot of references to the life of COVID. All right, so let's look at that for a moment. Right here in the introduction, it says, although viruses can become airborne dust aerosols, viruses rapidly lose infectivity in the air. By contrast, virus survival increases when liquid droplets contaminate surfaces, especially plastic and stainless steel, with long half-lives of 7 to 6 hours respectively. So on particular things such as copper and cardboard, we can see that the virus might be able to live for 7 to 6 hours. So how many of us are still receiving packages on our doorstep that we may want to consider, right? So again, go back to the methods. And the methods that we want to look at here are just exactly how they conducted this, this particular test. And the way that they did that is they did it using household spray bottles. So rather than using individuals, like it says we used household spray bottles filled with aqueous suspension of 12 probiotic cultured dairy products. So they used a lot of these bacteriums, and that's what they used to run it through. Now, finally, we need to understand that this particular study did give us something that I had never heard before as relates to sanitizing your household or makeshift face covering. And like it says here, we highlight the value of ironing because humid and dry heat produced by an iron is safe in the excess of minimum temperatures needed to destroy the virus. So rather than washing your face covering, one point from this article is that you can iron them. And then after that, they state that their findings show that over 99% of the sprayed mist was contained by the face coverings. All right, now let's look at this though, because then they go on to state something rather interesting. And it goes on down here to say, of note, we emphasize that face covers must be used in conjunction with existing recommendations on hand washing and sneezing into one's arm sleeve, which again is rather strange if they're showing that the spray bottle was able to be absorbed by 99%. Now, here is the concluding statement from this article where it says, in conclusion, we demonstrated that two-layer household textiles produced a profound reduction of environmental droplet contamination as effectively as medical-grade materials, encouraging mandating the synchronous implementation of textile face covers while discouraging using medical masks in public will help control COVID-19. The interesting thing here is where it states will help. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if this particular study was so certain, then why would it only help? Why would it not control it as they tried to state earlier? Now, through it, they also talk quite a bit about the methods that using the spray bottle instead of an actual person was gravely reducing the effectiveness of this study, and the fact that they only sprayed 3 times, again, not super saturating the medium in a way that most of us would do if you were wearing the face covering for hours at a time. But let's try to keep moving on here, as this is taking quite a long time. Moving on to Article 16, which is face covering, aerosol dispersion, and mitigation of virus transmission risk. Another very interesting one as we jump into it. Now, one of the important things here again is that it says, that these articles should not be relied upon without context to guide clinical practice or health-related behavior and should not be reported in the news media as established information. Now, again, this is right from Cornell University, ladies and gentlemen. And so, again, very interesting that it would state that very clearly, right? Now, right up here in the abstract, and I know that we don't like to read these, but look at this briefly, right? Surgical and handmade masks and face shields generate several leakage jets, including intense backward and downward jets that may present major hazards. We also simulated an aerosol generating procedure, and we showed that this is a major hazard for clinicians. These results can aid policymakers to make informed decisions and PPE developers to improve their product effectiveness by design. Why is that so interesting to me? Well, once again, very interesting that this particular article goes through and it talks a lot about the leakages that come out, and that this particular methodology of using a face covering and trying to mitigate the virus may not be everything that we feel that it is. Now, right here in section 3.3, it talks all about the particular leakage. And you can see how intense the leakage is down at the bottom. And on this one, as the person's continued to breathe heavy, that it's allowing for significant leakage depth, which is, again, a potentially dangerous that should be carefully considered, is that downward jet, okay, which again is generated by all face coverings. So again, as it says here, conversely, surgical and handmade masks and facials generate significant leakage jets. And so as we continue to look at these linkage jets, we want to look at and try to understand, are we discussing that with our masks, right? How many of us see people with a mask on, but they're touching it and they're lifting it away from their face and they're breathing and they're this and they're that? You know, a lot of it is very, very difficult to look at in a practical setting where people not trained, non-medical professionals that know, hey, once you put a mask on, you just don't touch it. But how many people do we see at the store or elsewhere that have a mask on and they're touching it? Who knows the last time it was cleaned? Who knows the last time that it was changed? Very many things, but again, we're led to believe that if you have the mask on, it magically is something that will 100% work. Now here it says a limitation of our experimental setup is that it does not reveal the absolute maximum distance that a virus-laden fluid particle can travel. It says furthermore, we tested only one person and one mannequin while coughing. Hence, the results do not allow to conclusively identify safe distances for different PPEs. All right, but it does say, however, because droplet evaporation and aerosol buoyancy vary substantially with temperature and humidity, it might not be meaningful searching for conclusive values. Goes on to further state, other limitations are the measured signal is the integral value along the line of sight from the camera, and thus there is no information on the velocity distribution along this line. The temperature of the masks may affect the temperature of the jet, and thus its signal. Within the limits of this work, these results revealed some key relative differences between face covers that can aid policymakers to make informed decisions and PPE developers. Great big long article, which again is cited as, is it mitigating the virus transmission risk? I don't know that this really does that. In fact, as much as it focuses on the several and severe leakages, becomes extremely problematic in my mind. If we come back over, though, article number 17, and this is kind of a fun one, right? Where it talks about simple respiratory protection, evaluation, and the filtration performance of cloth masks and common fabric materials against 20 to 1,000 nanometer size particles. Well, let's jump into this guy, okay? Again, the abstract, good news, we can click and get the entire article. And so here we are. Now, right here in the introduction of this particular article, it states very clearly, right here in the introduction, these household materials are not designed for respiratory protection, and their use may provide a false sense of protection because their effectiveness against larger size particles, including viruses, is not well understood. Then it goes on to say, this indicates that further studies are needed to better understand the filtration performance of cloth masks and common fabric materials against a wide range of particle sizes, including the size of many viruses. Now, there was a 1959 article, right? And it states right here, in one study, the filtration efficacy of a number of fabric materials was tested using human subjects. The authors reported that the filtration efficiency of single-layer bath towel, cotton shirt, handkerchief, and other materials was in the 28 to 73% range. This is where we start to try to figure out how effective are these masks. Well, this 1959 said it might be this effective against Bacillus globulus aerosols. But look at this, okay? This is 2,000 nanometer mass median diameter, which is approximately 20 times bigger than the coronavirus. As we move on under the materials and methods, it says, it should be noted that none of the other fabric materials was designed to be used as a filtering media. Okay, so we're using something that, again, was never designed to be that way. Now they go through and they look at a variety of different materials and the penetration that was able to happen through that. But let's move down to the conclusion. So right here under the conclusion, it states very clearly, and we're going to read this entire paragraph. Common fabric materials and cloth masks showed a wide variation in penetration values for polydisperse, 40 to 90%, as well as monodisperse aerosols particles in the 20 to 1000 nanometer range. The penetration levels obtained for fabric materials against both polydisperse and monodisperse aerosols were much higher than the value for the control N95 respiratory, which, again, let's remember, ladies and gentlemen, we saw another study that looked at the N95 respiratory and said that even that is not 100%. But in this particular study, they're looking at that as the gold standard. N95 respiratory filter media, but were in the range found for some surgical masks in the previous studies. Penetrations of monodisperse aerosol particles slightly increased at 16.5 centimeter face velocities, while polydisperse aerosols showed no significant effect except one fabric mask with an increase. The penetration values obtained for common fabric materials indicate that only marginal respiratory protection can be expected for submicron particles, taking into consideration face seal leakage. Okay, so again, what does it say? Only marginal respiratory protection. But what are we being told, right? We're being told that these are 80% effective. And ladies and gentlemen, that is not consistent with the data. Many of you know me from last year when I went through and was spending each day at the Salt Lake Capitol reviewing legislation. And the devil is certainly in the details as it relates to what was in a bill and what was not in a bill. So here we are once again, and we need to desperately understand these articles. Article number 18, we're almost there. Aerosol filtration efficiency of common fabrics used in respiratory cloth masks. So let's look at this guy. I want to show you something first. I'm just going to do a search for the word can. And you can see that the word can is used 23 times, right? Can result, can mean, can make a difference, can result, can potentially. So before we really start to evaluate this particular article as the end-all be-all proof, just know and understand how many times the word can is being used in here. Now, the other thing that they talk about in here is the proper fit. So let's look at that for just a moment in that particular section. So right here, we get into it and it talks about this. So let's read this entire spot, right? So it says, whereas the surgical masks provides moderate, over 60%, and excellent, close to 100%, particle exclusion below and above 300 nanometers, respectively, the test carried out with the 1% opening surprisingly resulted in a significant drops in the mask efficiencies across the entire size range. What in the world did we just read, ladies and gentlemen? Well, we just saw that if there was a 1% opening or leakage in your mask, meaning a very small leak on either side of your nose, maybe 1% on one side, 1% on the other side, 1% on each cheek, 1% under your chin, and look at what we see here was a significant drop in mask efficiencies. Now that's important for us to remember and understand here, right? And it says, in this case, the two holes were about 0.635 centimeters in diameters in the mask area was this. Similar trends in efficiency drops are seen in cotton silk hybrid samples as well. Hole size also has an influence in the filtration efficiency. In the case of an N95 mask, increasing hole size from 0.5 to 2% of the cloth sample area reduced the weighted average filtration efficiency from 60 to 50%. So one hole in an N95 mask or one spot for a leakage reduced the efficiency of 60 to 50%. So down here under the conclusion, we find that cotton, natural silk, and chiffon can provide good protection, typically above 50% in the entire 10 meter to 6 nanometer range, provided that they have a tight weave. Now that sounds pretty good, right? But there is an interesting thing, right, where it says, and let's find it for you really quick. So right below that where it says, our findings indicate that leakages around the mask areas can degrade efficiencies by 50% or more, pointing out the importance of fit. So again, ladies and gentlemen, how many of us are touching our masks, don't have it sealed, don't have it pushed in exactly how it should be, but we are being led to believe that that mask is over 80% effective, when in reality, that is not at all what the science concludes. Well, this will be our last one. This has taken a lot longer than I thought, but let's try it anyways. Article 19, measurements of filtration efficiencies of healthcare and consumer materials using modified respiratory fit tester setup. As we come in to this particular article, we know that there's an ongoing debate about important aspects of masks and what they are attempting to block. Okay, so let's look at that for just a second. Okay, right here where it says, furthermore, there's an ongoing academic discourse about the definition of terms such as droplet, droplet nucleoli, and aerosol for purposes of respiratory and aerosol transmission. Now, why is that important? Well, because so much of this, in fact, all of this is studying respiratory droplets. But it's saying right here that the definition of that is an ongoing academic discourse, right? And that this is not proven. So let's look at what these guys refer to as the FE, or filtration efficiency. FE for consumer grade materials ranged from 35 to 53%. Now, this was an interesting article that they actually tried using coffee filters in it. So if you're interested in the effectiveness of a coffee filter, jump in here and look at it, right? Some of the limitations of this particular article, where it says right here, lastly, this study focuses on the FEs, right? Now, FE is filtration efficacy of mask materials without addressing fit. Now, how in the world can they do that, since we just got done reading the Conda article just a moment ago about small holes very small holes, and that those were reducing the effectiveness of the mask by up to 50% per hole. But it then goes on to say, our results show that certain material combinations can achieve over 95%. But studies have shown that even a minimal compromise in the seal can cause a significant loss in filtration capability. Further studies are needed. So again, ladies and gentlemen, I apologize so much for taking so much of your time. I don't know how many of you even made it this far, but as you can see, we're only 19 articles in to the 45 that are available on the CDC website. I would love to continue to go through these additional articles. If there are some of you that would like that, please drop a note down below. Let me know if you're interested in that. My hope is that this has been helpful. And again, please just remember, this is just a simple person reading the words rather than looking at the headlines, looking at the methods rather than only looking at a statement, and looking at some of the limitations and looking further into the actual documents. And my hope is that we can all start doing that, right? As more of us start reading these articles and looking deeply into them and finding out how is it that we can be best protected, and how is it that we can correctly deal with not only what's going on currently, but what may go on in the future. And again, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time.